Okay, we've heard in there about Labour's 5-point plan for jobs. I want to pick up on two things. Firstly, the problem of how we get jobs and growth in regions like the West Midlands and cities like Coventry, where there's a disproportionate level of unemployment. The last figures are 9% back in March, unemployment in Coventry. It's no doubt bigger than that now. The Regional Growth Fund was mentioned. We know it's small beer from the Coalition, £1.4 billion of Regional Growth Fund money from the Coalition. It's pretty much bypassing Coventry and the West Midlands. Yet Labour's 5-point plan for jobs talks about the Regional Growth Fund, but only £200 million more. Do you think there's an acceptance there that there's not much money around in terms of public investment to help grow the regions?
Sure, obviously we're restricted in terms of the amount of money that there is around, but I think that Labour's 5-point plan would make an enormous difference to getting our economy going, because immediately you cut VAT, you put more money into people's pockets. By using the bank bonus tax to get the young unemployed back to work and support enterprise, you'd make a difference. So in countless ways, I think we can make a difference. I think the problem is the government doesn't have the political will. They're just saying, let's stick to a deficit reduction plan which isn't working. And that's the thing that the Prime Minister's got to understand.
How do we do that very complicated problem, though, that's been talked about for decades of having less reliance on the financial sector, less reliance on the South East, less reliance on London? There's a Westminster consensus now that has to happen. But how can it happen from Labour, for instance, if you're only proposing, if you think that the government has an active role to play, 1.6 billion in the Regional Growth Fund rather than 1.4 billion from the
We're
Coalition?
talking about something very simple today, which is how we use the £240 billion, hard figure to get your head around, £240 billion that government spends on procurement. And we're saying that we've got to use that money to actually do much better at driving economic growth and driving success, including in our regions, whether that's in innovation or other ways in which British companies can be supported. You know, we've seen recent events, Bombardier, BAE, which are not just about how much money you're putting into a fund, but about how government is using its procurement. So I think there are different ways. The banks is another example. We've got to change the way our banks work so that they actually do a better job of serving our manufacturing industry. So it is partly about government resources, but government is already spending a lot of resources. They're just not spending them in the way that is going to support regional growth in the way that I think it could.
And if you talk to businesses, as you know very well, they say the biggest barrier to creating jobs is getting money out of the banks, getting credit to finance the investment that we want. Sir Richard Lambert, I was speaking with last week, said that in 2005, 90% of growth companies were getting the lending they needed. Now it's more like 50%. Particularly those growth companies that have got the ability to create jobs are saying they can't get the money, and yet there's nothing on that in Labour's 5-point strategy for growth.
No, but obviously something we're looking at is the way that the banks are working and the way that the banks are serving small businesses, and we're going to be saying more about this in the coming weeks. Look, I think one thing the government's got to do is they've got to hold the banks to much tougher targets on the way they lend. At the moment, the government has targets on lending that allow the banks to claim a great success, even though net lending is actually going down, not up, which is what's happening at the moment. And that's got to change, and we've got to find ways, including through the state-owned banks, of actually making sure the banks do a better job of lending to our small businesses. And I think there are practical things that can be done.
It appears that the taxpayer-owned RBS is set to award bonuses of something like 500 million.
I think that'll be the wrong thing for them to do.
And yet Labour's proposal is just for a £2 billion extra tax on bankers' bonuses. We can equate that with another figure of 18 billion from the Coalition coming off welfare benefits. Is 2 billion just gesture politics? It's not enough.
I think it's pretty.
Can we take more from the banks?
I think it's pretty important. I think the bonus tax is pretty important. And look, you know, there's a big difference between ourselves and the government on the banks. They're cutting taxes for the banks this year. They want to cut taxes for the banks further in the future. We're saying don't do that. Use some of the money from a tax cut for the banks that they want to bring in to lower tuition fees, and actually put a bonus tax on a tax on the bankers' bonuses to get young unemployed people back to work, to help construction, to help business. I think it's a very, very clear difference between ourselves and the government. And so, you know, I have to say to you on the banks, I think that that they are actually letting the banks basically get away with it.
You're talking about tackling growing inequality, growing inequality that continued under 13 years of the Labour government. You've in some ways suggested that Occupy London is resonating with ordinary families up and down the country. Given that, and you're saying that you need to tackle short-term, fast-buck capitalism, is absolutely right. In many ways, that would strike a chord.
Sure.
Nonetheless, you're taking £2 billion from the banks, extra, over and above what the government's doing at the moment. The Institute for Public Policy Research seems to think that you could take 20 billion from the banks without penalising them, without driving investment abroad. Is that the case? Can more be done to make the banks pay their way?
Obviously, that's something that we look at year to year, and we look at the necessary what's necessary to do. But look, we've got practical proposals right across the board. Take the issue of top pay. I say that if top executives can't justify their pay to an ordinary worker on their remuneration committee, because I think every remuneration committee, the committees that set top pay should have one, then they shouldn't be allowed to have it. It's a very big difference for a government that's essentially sitting on its hands and not even implementing the reports, the recommendations of their own report. So, look, I think you're totally right to say that there is a real issue about how we build for the future a different way forward for our economy so that we don't have the fast buck and something for nothing. That's what we've started talking about as a party. We're going to talk about it a lot more. But let me just also be completely frank with you. And maybe this is sort of what politics needs to do more of. It's going to take time to do that. It's not about instant solutions. Look, we've had 30 years where more or less, some of these things have been accepted, which I don't think are right, about what happens in financial services, that inequality is inevitable, and we've got to turn that around. But look, it's turning around quite a big thing to turn around. It's going to take us time.
Finally, how do we curb those top-end salaries?
I think much greater accountability, not just to shareholders, but much greater accountability to the workforce as well.
Thank you very much.
Why are you here in Rugby?
Well, we're here in Rugby because up and down this